Should we get started in the next couple minutes? Does anyone have a preference?
That sounds good to me.
Yeah, I don't see the first paper's presenter. I think I'm listed second. I'm fine with just starting now. I just need to share my slides.
All right, that sounds good.
Okay, so someone will just cut me off. I'll keep an eye on the time so that I don't go like over 10 minutes or eight minutes, whatever it was.
All right.
Let's see. Okay. All right. Can everyone see? Yeah. And here, I'll get my video. There.
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay, awesome. I'm Lewis Sears. I just actually defended my dissertation at Cornell, so I can only say I'm from Cornell for a little while longer. But thanks for joining today. I really appreciate the opportunity to present at AAEA. And today I'm presenting a paper that's not currently planned to be in my dissertation. It's a working paper that I'm looking at moving forward with members of my committee. It's titled Moment-Based Markov Equilibrium Estimation of High Dimension Dynamic Games, an application to groundwater management in California. It's joint work with members of my committee, Professors Cynthia Lynn Lowell and Todd Walter at Cornell, and Professor Gerald Torres at Yale. And I'm looking forward to any comments or questions you all have so I can work to improve it. All right. So briefly, groundwater management is an important complex problem around the world with implications for development, for agriculture and economic growth broadly. The primary reason why groundwater is expected to suffer from inefficient use is due to its nature as a common pool resource. An aquifer is shared by many groundwater extractors, and the spatial flows of groundwater across space between property lines means that individuals can't exclusively manage the stock of groundwater underneath their land. On top of that, in an arid climate like California, or much of California, where extraction exceeds recharge, groundwater is partially non-renewable, meaning that it needs to be managed dynamically for long-term sustainable use. This paper is an extension of another paper I worked on in my dissertation, in which I estimated a structural model of a dynamic groundwater extraction game in an environment without formal limits on groundwater extraction for the users, which we termed open access. We used real data from before and after the implementation of a system of tradable and storable pumping limits, or what we called quantified property rights for groundwater, which were implemented in later years through a groundwater adjudication. And we used counterfactual analysis to derive short-run welfare implications. What we found were that water districts in our model tended to underprice water relative to efficient levels. We found that implementing this system of tradable, storable water rights induced changes in behavior, but that the short-term welfare effects were very modest, and that the additional social benefit was held down by this fact that these water districts still underpriced water even when the property rights system was implemented. We also found that players were generally myopic about the future, and that they would have continued to deplete the groundwater basin that we examined in the absence of this policy intervention through this property rights system. Our analysis in that paper was limited, though, by the ability of players to fully adjust to our counterfactual assumptions. When we modeled behavior, we could only look at kind of short-run effects, so they couldn't really adjust to the changes that we were implementing in our counterfactual analysis. And what we'd like to do is have a full long-run solution so that we could look at the kind of long-run welfare implications of these changes, like implementing a property rights system. To do that, we needed to have a full solution method for our dynamic game and an estimation procedure that was consistent with that solution method. The difficulty with that is in that previous paper, we assumed perfect information. And players need to then take all payoff relevant state information into account when they condition and choose their actions or their extraction levels. That means they need to take account of the level of groundwater stock on their land, but also their expectation about the evolution of groundwater stock into the future, which depends on the level of groundwater stock at all other points of land in the model. And as the number of players in the game and the number of wells in the system grows, that amount of information grows exponentially and makes the problem computationally infeasible to solve. So what we needed to do was find a way to shrink our dynamic game in a realistic way and produce results that are consistent essentially with a different understanding of how players evaluated information. So for this paper, we're going to allow players to track the level of stock on their land, as well as the average level of stock in the system. And we can think of about that in practice as a player having a pump test done in the spring, getting a measurement of where the water table level is on their land or what their depth to groundwater is, and then looking at any publicly available monitoring information to get a general idea of what the stock looks like in their region. Then we estimate a model that uses the same data set as our previous paper, but here we're going to essentially we're going to estimate a maximum likelihood model in which we nest a backwards induction solution to our new version of our dynamic game. In other words, we're going to solve backwards for each player in the game under a set of parameters, predict behavior, compare it to the actual behavior in the data set, and see if perturbing the parameters a bit improves our fit. And we do that until convergence. We can then treat any counterfactual analysis we do as being long run, since we can solve the full version of our dynamic game under any changes to our assumptions, and thus allow players to fully adjust to those changes. What our approach buys us is the ability to analyze the full value function of players. So here I'm showing the value function of one player in 1 year in our dynamic game as a function of the depth to groundwater on their own land, which is the x-axis, and the mean depth to groundwater in the system, which is the y-axis. And so what we can then do is both validate our model results by looking at our previous paper and finding that our general welfare results are very similar to our previous paper, which makes us feel fairly confident that they're capturing the same kind of dynamics that we did in our other paper. We can also look at things like this consumer surplus weighting problem, which we found in our previous paper, where water districts were pricing water too cheaply, and we find the same issue here. But what we can do differently here is actually resolve our full dynamic game and measure the levels of welfare gain from changing certain features. We find that this consumer surplus weighting problem or pricing water too cheap created a social welfare loss of about $7 million per year, which is large and statistically significant. We find that removing spatial externalities in our model does not create a large difference. This is one particular groundwater basin, and we can't drive any kind of overarching conclusions from that. Although in this case, clearly the objectives of agents in our model were much more important than the presence of spatial externalities. We also solve a static version of our model and compare it to the full dynamic version. And we find that the results are very close, which suggests a result that these players are not really dynamically optimizing in this open access environment, which kind of makes sense since they have very little control over the stock of groundwater in the future, since there are no water rights or any other way to really control behavior amongst all the players. And so they would expect to have the groundwater stock driven down over time. We also run some regressions on the value function. I'll simplify this by saying essentially that we find that players tend to value groundwater stock in the immediate term on their land and not value it on all other plots of land in the system. We also find that there's some sorting where players who could earn the most from groundwater extraction extracted from more difficult or more expensive locations, which kind of makes sense in principle. And then finally, we do an exercise where we determine the value of information or additional information for players by allowing each of them to re-optimize when they have access to full perfect information about the system. And we find that the results are actually very close to our baseline results, which suggests that giving them this additional information isn't very valuable. And that again makes sense with our finding that there's very little dynamic optimization and that these players don't really value the stock of groundwater outside their immediate land. Next steps, we're hoping to simulate a longer term version of our model and take things like climate change into account. We're also hoping to build in artificial recharge and do some counterfactual simulations in which we examine like a property rights system and determine how different features of a property rights system will impact behavior over the longer term. And so that's all I have for today. If there are any questions or comments, I'm definitely happy to hear them. Thanks. Awesome. Okay. So if there aren't any questions, I can move on to the next person. I am going to have to leave around 10:30 just because I have work meetings. I've started my job after PhD. So let me just see. Okay. I'll stop sharing now. Would anyone like to go next? I'm trying to see.
If there's no particular order, I'd be happy to go next.
Yeah, that sounds fine with me.
Okay, great. Thanks. Let me get my screen set up real quick. Okay, can everybody see my my slides?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Awesome. Cool. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for that really interesting presentation, Louis. So my name is Monica Savos, and I'm an economist at USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, and I'm going to be presenting on the economics of plant-based milk based on ongoing work with my colleagues Sharon Rashab and Kevin Camp. And I have Sharon on the call with us as well. Okay. So the demand for plant-based milks in the United States has been trending up. And according to the Plant-Based Food Association, US retail sales reached $2.6 billion in 2021. Plant-based milk sales showed tremendous growth, 33% larger compared to 2019 sales. Meanwhile, animal-based milk sales have continued to decline. There are a variety of plant-based milks, but common ones include almond, soy, coconut, and more recently, we've seen increased demand and supply for oat milk. Consumers choose to purchase plant-based milks for a variety of reasons, including concerns for the environment, animal welfare, or even dietary health. But because these markets are still new and considered to be niche, we lack the knowledge about price determination and interrelationships between the different types of plant-based milks being consumed. On top of this lack of knowledge of price relationship, price is commonly cited as an impediment to further increased demand of plant-based milks. So the purpose of this research is to further understand those price determinants. If we can pinpoint drivers of these milk prices, then we can have a better idea of how producers may be able to exploit economies of sales, how much price volatility may be driven by the changes in input prices or other external factors, and we may be better equipped to forecast plant-based milk prices based on changes in these exogenous variables. We're going to be using scanner data to look at soy, coconut, and almond milk prices between 2014 and 2019. There may be questions about why we didn't include other milks, so I'll say right now that the other plant-based milks tend to have much fewer observations over this particular time period because particularly oat milk is a more recent addition to the market. Like I mentioned, there is still a dearth of research on plant-based products. Most research on plant-based milks prior to 2020 looked at own and cross-price elasticities between cow's milk and select plant-based milks. Broadly, what the literature found was that own price elasticity of cow's, soy, and almond milk are negative and inelastic. In other words, quantities demanded for each milk were largely unresponsive to changes in their own prices. So people appear to be fairly stuck to the type of milk that they like to consume. Meanwhile, the cross-price elasticity for cow soy and cow almond were almost zero. So in other words, the plant-based markets have limited effect on the cow's market, on the cow's milk market. One study looking at cross-price elasticity between almond and soy milk found negative elasticity between the two, showing that the two can be considered substitutes. But the literature does leave us with a lot of questions about the interrelationships. As most price elasticity studies are over a decade old, and the newer studies did not look into the relationship between the different plant-based milks themselves. So moving on to our data, the prices for almond, soy, and coconut milk consistently fall somewhere between $3 and $4 per half gallon. Coconut milk has historically had the highest price and the most variation out of the three milks. Meanwhile, almond milk is the lowest of the three. Something to note is that the raw material for almond milks, for almond milks, almonds have been declining in prices in recent years due to overproduction in California. Cow's milk also falls between this range, but for a full gallon, so plant-based milks tend to be about twice as expensive. We tested these series for stationarity and find that all series are stationary, meaning that we can model the relationship using vector autoregressive model, or VAR. VAR models structure the relationship between the variables as linear functions of past lags themselves and of other dependent variables. In other words, we expect that, for example, the price of almond milk last week will affect the price of almond milk this week, but will also affect the price of coconut milk and soy milk this week. This makes sense because these milks are substitutes of each other to some extent. As price of one milk increases, so the demand, as the price for one milk increase, the demand for now cheaper milk rise in response, increasing the prices as well. Something else that may be happening is that retailers may be indexing the price for one milk against another to shield against high price volatility. But these are not the only expected drivers of the price of these milks. And so aside from including the three dependent variables in our VAR, we are going to include several exogenous variables as well. First, plant-based beverages have distinct input markets and are likely to be subject to some independent supply and demand side innovations. For example, almonds are water-intensive crops grown in California, whereas coconuts are grown in tropical climates and imported to the United States. Relationships among the plant-based milks and their inputs may vary. For this conference paper, we use monthly raw input prices. Soybean prices come from USDA NAS, and almond and coconut prices are monthly trade, export, and import prices, respectively, from FAS. Now this presents an issue since our retail data is at the weekly level, and we did not want to lose information via aggregation. So for this paper, we used two different methods to disaggregate the monthly raw input data: interpolation and repeating the series for that month. We estimate the same VAR model using the two different techniques. Fortunately, our future analysis will not have this issue since we now have obtained weekly raw input price data from a different USDA agency. So getting ahead of ourselves though, the model had the same results for almond, all variables with the exception of the effect of gasoline. So that's the perfect segue to the next point, which is aside from raw materials, we also included lagged retail cow's milk, gasoline price, and measure of inflation. All lag lengths for these variables were determined via information criterion. We included gasoline prices to account for the shipping and manufacturing costs, and we included the personal consumption expenditure price index to account for economy-wide changes in the cost of goods and services that impact both input and general retail prices. So I'll note again that these results are preliminary and we will be updating the data as well as our modeling approaches. However, these results provide an initial indication of the relationship between the 3 plant-based milks and the exogenous regressors included. So we find these informative. Let's look at the orthogonalized impulse response functions first. The solid line in each panel represents the impulse response function, the impulse response from a positive 1 standard deviation shock to the price of the first named milk. For example, the top middle panel show the effects of a positive shock in almond prices has on the price of soy milk. The dashed lines are the 95% confidence interval. First of all, each milk is influenced by their own lagged price. Looking at the top left panel, you see the price of almond milk initially jumps after a shock in its own price, but quickly starts falling. And by week 6, almond milk prices are back to equilibrium. We see a similar pattern for own price effects across the diagonal. Given the substitutability among plant-based milks, it's not surprising to find the prices of the 3 milks respond to each other as well. Each milk is influenced by at least one other type of plant-based milk. For example, the price of almond milk is influenced by movement in coconut milk's price, as seen in the bottom left panel. Similarly, looking at the effect of soy milk on coconut milk in the middle right panel, the price of coconut milk initially increases, then returns back to equilibrium after a few weeks. So in summary, in general, almond, soy, and coconut milk prices appear to be moving in tandem. We're also interested in the effect of the exogenous variables on plant-based milks. We find that even after accounting for the cross-price effects between plant-based milks, the price for cow's milk remains an important component of pricing. We find that a 1% increase in cow's milk in the previous month leads to a 0.21% and 0.15% increase in the prices for almond and soy milk respectively. This is consistent with previous literature on the effect and magnitude of cow's milk's effect on plant-based milk prices. Our VAR with the interpolated input series finds no effect from gasoline on the plant-based prices, but our alternative specification finds a small and positive effect. This could be related to location of the manufacturing facilities and the distance of the commodities and plant-based milks themselves have to travel. For example, a large share of the soy milk market is organic. While the United States is a major soybean producer, organic soybeans are mainly imported. The most widely used port for organic soybeans is in San Francisco, with only 35% of organic soy milk facilities in San Francisco. Similar cases can be made for coconut milk made with imported coconuts and almond milk. While almonds are produced fully in California, many almond milk facilities are located outside of the state. We also find that coconut milk and soy milk prices are sensitive to inflation. A 1% increase in PCEPI half a year prior increases the price of soy and coconut milks by 1.7 and 3.1%. So moving on to inputs, an increase in the price for fresh shelled almonds has a small positive impact on soy and coconut milk prices. Also, a 1% increase in the price for coconuts 6 months ago is related to a 0.03% decrease in the current price for coconut milk. So that's a very, very small change that we picked up based on coconut monthly import values. Relative to relative to cow's milk producers, plant-based counterparts spend a large portion of the cost on packaging, production, bottling, and research, and not in development, overhead, marketing, and logistics. Bearing that in mind, on average, 85 to 90% of plant-based milk is water by composition. So we did not expect raw materials to be the most significant driver of plant-based price movements. Still, our analysis has some ways to go to solidify our understanding of price drivers. We will be extending the analysis to include 2020 prices, and we are in the process of updating the data that we used in our analysis. Here we were forced to use NASS monthly feed soybean prices, and we will exchange those for non-GMO and organic food grade soybean prices. Then we will exchange monthly almond and coconut prices for weekly terminal price data from AMS. We will also explore the possible nonlinearity of the relationship between these series and incorporate other covariants. So thank you all so much for your time. If there's any time, or I don't know if we should wait till the end, I'm happy to have any comments or questions. So thank you all so much. And so I
have a question, if you don't mind. Sorry.
Sure.
Did I understand correctly when you said that there's no substitution between cow's milk and animal product? Well, and plant-based milk, sorry.
So no, I would not. So our results really did not show that. What we didn't show a we did not show that there's no clear price movement from plant-based. Plant-based milks don't clearly affect the price of cow's milk, but that doesn't mean that there's no substitutability between them.
I think, well, in future result, I think it would be very interesting to see that, basically, whether people are adding up a milk rather than actually, because a lot of the policy talks are about shifting demand, right?
Right.
Whereas in this case, there are different policy scenarios if you actually have adding up of the two. You're actually not reducing the demand for animal products at all.
Right, yeah, that's absolutely. So there was this really, so we had another paper that was about the price. I guess more relevantly, there was a, Stewart and Cessna had a paper that was about like the extent to which the plant-based milks market actually were reducing the demand for cow's milk, and to what extent the decline of cow's milk was a result of the plant-based milks. And what they found was, although there has been like a decades-long decline in cow's milk, so it certainly was not only the result of plant-based milk, they found that a small percentage of the recent shift away from plant-based milks could be attributed to cow's milk, but the majority was a more longer-term secular shift downwards. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Sharon.
Yeah, sorry. Well, the other way around. So some small portion of the cow's milk market decline could be attributed to plant-based milk demand, but in general, the cow's milk market, first of all, is just so large as a market share that any of the switchers that are going between cow's milk and plant-based milks is still a very small proportion of the market and having a fairly small effect. And then the other thing is that cow's milk pricing is a lot more complex and a lot more tied to federal policies. And so what we found in a different paper is that cow's milk prices are just not being affected by any shocks in plant-based milks. But that is not necessarily going to be the case, Luca, like you said, as the market possibly, or probably continues to shift, we might see something different. And the other thing is that retailers are obviously No, obviously, but with very volatile markets, they're likely to index their prices to other markets. And at this point, it's very possible that plant-based milk is being indexed both to each other and also to cow's milk price, just because it is still the market leader. But yeah, good question. And these relationships are just going to continue to change as the market becomes larger, as it continues to grow.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the question, Luca, and thank you for everyone for being here. I guess we can go on to, I don't know that there's like an official order for who goes next. I guess we're just taking volunteers. So if anybody would like to volunteer to go next.
Yeah, I can go next if no one wants to go before me.
Sounds good.
Yeah, sounds good. Go ahead.
Let me see. I have a lot of slides. I think I can make the 8 minutes. Right. Let me set the timer on so I can know where I... Okay. Right. Thank you very much for having me here today, or being here with me. Basically, I'm presenting the result of a study that we did on some data from a Croatian supermarket as part of a bigger European project, trying to understand trying to evaluate a campaign that was run in Croatia promoting fruit and vegetable consumption. And this type of topic is very important because the estimates suggest that promotions on fruit and vegetable are around, are very, very rare. They probably around, well, estimates are around 2% of promotions are actually done on fruit and vegetables. And from one side, we know that promotions are really an important thing for retailer and for consumer. They actually allow from the perspective of retailers, they allow a sort dynamism in stock management because products enter and go out very quickly, and also allows increases in demand, both from increases in quantity as well as brand shifting. And traditionally, this is why retailers have been using promotion, but more recently, promotion are being used to create loyalty. So to actually have consumers giving people a reason, giving consumer a reason to come back. So you may be familiar with loyalty cards from coffee shops, but more frequently you find the same type of logic applied to club card or loyalty cards in supermarket, whereby you get prizes or rewards after spending a certain amount of time in the supermarket or a certain amount of money within the supermarket. And the aim is very much to understand whether frequency reward programs, which are the rewards based on frequency and on loyalty, can be used to motivate consumption of fruit and vegetables. And to do so, we use data from a campaign run in Croatia by the largest supermarket known as Consum. The campaign was based on having soft plush toys like the one you see in the picture, ran for 9 weeks during autumn and they run up to Christmas. But we also have data before and after the campaign. And this is a very important period, incidentally, because autumn is the period where fruit and vegetable production actually decreases. And people would get specific points for buying selected fruit and vegetable that were changing weekly, on top of the normal point for every 50 Croatian kuna spent in store. The key difference between the literature on frequency reward program and this type of exercise is that achieving the reward or achieving the right for a reward was free. So as in, people buy their fruit and vegetables and automatically they are entitled to a reward, but the reward has to be paid for either with points or it's a mixture of points and money, the cost is non-linear to the extent that the more points one puts, the cheaper it becomes to buy a toy. And frequency rewards program are known, which is basically what I'm saying here, works on two premises. It gives people pressure, so people have pressure. Sorry, allow me to locate the course. But they get pressure for collecting points by by paying. They collect points, and they have pressure. They are motivated to reach. The moment they start collecting the point, they're automatically motivated to collect more points, which is the Kivets article. If you have seen the Kivets article, this is actually a pretty strong effect, even giving them an illusionary starting point. So giving them 3 points that require the same effort actually seems to motivate people. But there's also a rewarded behavior to the extent that the behavior may actually be shifting. So people will be spending more if there is a positive rewarded behavior once the promotion is taken off. And the rewarded behavior basically motivates individuals through the reward. So there are psychological and non-psychological effects associated to this. But traditionally, the reward is free. So there is an interesting study that Taylor and Nestle mentioned here, which is an American study where consumer would get a free turkey for Thanksgiving if they had spent a sufficient amount of money prior to Thanksgiving. And that in that case was automatic. The moment you reach the threshold, you get the reward. Whereas in our case, we actually have that the consumer has to do an additional effort and accept the payment for the reward in order to have the reward. And the data we have is loyalty card data. We have almost 270,000 consumers. We have 3 9-week periods per year. We have 2 years. One is then 2018, where the promotion was in place, was the campaign was in place. And 2017 was the prior year where there was no intervention for everyone. And we had 9 weeks of intervention. But we also had data for the 9 weeks prior to the intervention and the 9 weeks post-intervention. The post-intervention is the one that would reveal the rewarded behavior, therefore, to understand whether the reward in itself was motivated in the long term. And we have data on fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, dried fruit and vegetables. We have all other foods and total food expenditure. We also know the toys that the consumer, how many toys a family purchased. And we know loyalty, whether the consumer is a loyal consumer. So we know how often, how many trips to the store consumers make in a given year. And we also have some general socio-demographic variables such as gender, age, and country of residence. And the retailer also has their own segmentation, which we don't use very much. Well, crucially, we also have expenditure in children and babies, which you will see in a second is which is very important for us to understand who is buying the toys. To identify the effect, we use a difference in difference estimator. Basically, we have 2 groups here. We have a group, which is the control, which bought food and collected the stickers required to have the food, so collected points, but didn't buy any toys, whereas and that's around 2/3 of the sample. And 1/3 of the sample collected the stickers and bought the toys. And we have a difference in difference in difference, a triple difference, because we have variation in sample, we have variation in year, and variation in periods. I have a question. Sorry, that was Louis leaving. Then there's a problem that membership here is not random. The decision to purchase is not a random choice, but there are some systematic variation, and therefore the coefficients here are not identified, strictly speaking. In reality, we probably could have done without doing this based on on the graphs, which I will show you in a second. But to adjust for the fact that participation is not random, we use a propensity score weighting approach, where we weight individuals based on their propensity score, which basically creates two samples that are strictly comparable on a probabilistic term. And just to give you an idea, this is the demographic characteristic, and you can see very clearly that the two samples are not comparable to the extent that gender varies significantly across groups. This comparison is only between the sticker toys group, the toys and no toys group. Age is not comparable across the two groups. The same family size in terms of having children and babies, in terms of loyalty, as well as in terms of composition of segments. Now, in terms of the parallel trend assumption, which is a key assumption for one of the key assumptions of difference in difference is that prior to the policy, the groups are moving similarly, so they are having similar trends. And actually, in that sense, the groups are not that different. So trends in sales are comparable. If you compare these curves visually, is not very different from this curve. So they have similar peaks here and there across both 2017 and 2018. This is only vegetable consumption. The same for fruit. We actually have similar peaks and similar dips on a weekly level. As these are dried fruit and vegetables. And again, prior to the intervention, we see similar peaks characterizing the curves in both years. Obviously, they do differ in the intercept, but this is actually captured by the estimation. This is other foods, and this is total food expenditure. And in the case, just to give you an idea, for vegetable is very visible. What we are estimating, we are trying to capture this change, because this is the change caused by the promotion. Obviously, the difference in difference does an interesting, that's the job we wanted to do, because we don't actually know how people would have behaved had they not taken a toys, and therefore we compare it against this increase, because we see an increase also in this group, and basically we calculate the difference between them. In terms of the propensity scores, the equation to calculate them is actually pretty interesting, because it's pretty relevant for us, because it tells us who's buying the toys. So this is a probit equation that we use to calculate the propensity scores. And what we see is that people who buy toys are generally female, age 25 to 44, who spend money on goods for children and for babies, and who are more loyal at the beginning. So they were spending more in the year, in the first week in the first period of the first year that we are in analysis. So they are actually more loyal women who have a family and in an age range where they have children. The estimates that we get, so we run a very simple or very uninformative, if you want, linear fixed effects regression. I say uninformative because the data has lots of zeros, so need to be dealt with. But basically, these are the estimates we are interested in. These are the DID. This is the difference, the triple difference. Whereas these are effectively the difference, the double difference. So how much they changed over here. But what we see is that everyone had an increase in fruit and in vegetable consumption, but there was a much bigger growth for people who actually purchased the toys. And we can see the increase in terms of half elasticities. It's an increase in consumption of 11%, 11.5% for those who purchased the toy. And basically they had an 11% increase in fruit and vegetable, but they also show an increase in every other food, which an increase in total spend in store. comparable to the group that didn't buy toys, these values remained positive and significant after the promotion was ended, whereas the values became negative for those who did not collect the reward. Now, obviously, because we have many zeros, we tried also running a Poisson fixed effect regression. And the advantage of the Poisson is also that the coefficient, in this case, we had to calculate the semi-elasticities from coefficients, whereas in this case, semi-elasticities are automatic, and we get an increase which is smaller than what we saw earlier. So it's an increase of around 7% in fruit and vegetables, and 10% in other food and all food. But the rewarded behavior effect remains significant, of around 3% for fruit and vegetables. We also tried using a fixed effect panel sample selection, which is the Wooldridge estimator for sample selection. Obviously, everyone in this group bought food, so all food as a category disappears because there's no sample selection. The correct estimator becomes this one. And for this group, we actually have even larger, using this estimator, we have larger estimates. In this estimator, we use log of expenditure as a dependent variable again to get semi-elasticities automatically. And we see, for using this estimator, an 18% increase in fruit and vegetable consumption during the promotion, which goes down to an increase of 7%. 7% after the promotion ends. And basically, this is my summary, in the sense we do find some effects. The effects vary with the estimator. I can see that I'm using the smallest estimates here, but interestingly, we don't find post-promotion bumps. Now, what do we find? We do find rewarded behavior effects, which are important for certain consumers, particularly to those consumers who did buy a toy. And there are psychological explanations of why this may happen. So there's some literature that shows that rewards can be, particularly voluntary rewards, the decision to pay for a desirable behavior tends to have positive effects on the self-esteem of the consumer, and so on. That's it. If you want more data, I have more data in the appendix. For those of you who have been wondering throughout the presentation, the banana won. The banana plush toy won. If you have any questions, feel free. Right. If there is no question for me, I think we can move to the next speaker. I don't know if there's someone who wants to volunteer. I'm not entirely sure who. I don't have the program.
I can go next.
I have to go next. This is Mario Miranda.
Okay, go ahead, Mario.
Okay, great.
Mario did this one.
Well, thank you, Ambali, Andrew, Monica, Luca, and Sharon for being here today. I come to you from Columbus, Ohio. It is morning here, and it looks like it's going to be a beautiful sunny day. I am going to be giving, let's see, I need to share screen. And, oopsie. Uh-oh. Okay, there we go. I'm going to have to share screen. And can everybody see my screen now? Anybody, please confirm. Can you see
No.
this?
No.
Okay, here we go.
I
got it.
cannot. Oh, there it
There you
is.
go.
There it is.
Yes, now yes.
All right, thank you. Yeah, we only have 8 minutes. Fortunately, I only have 1 point to make. And my talk is titled A Critique of Agricultural Risk Management Research. Rather ambitious title, meant to piss off a lot of people, but it's about effective risk aversion and demand for insurance. And this is work that I do in collaboration with Men-Fan Yen at National Sun Yat-sen University, who will be doing empirical work to support this work. And so let me just get started. Between 1970 and 2019 alone, the AJE published 849 articles with risk in the title. Obviously, risk, insurance are topics that have always been of great interest to agricultural economists. And quite a bit of work has been done and continues to be done in this area. And the majority of the work employs the von Neumann Morgenstern expected utility model. You saw this maybe even in Econ 100, or at least in your micro course, and certainly in your graduate work. And this is simply the agent possesses a utility of money function, and its curvature is a measure of the decision maker's aversion to risk. It's concave, and therefore insurance will be demanded. And it's this model that has been used repeatedly to perform research on risk management and insurance, both theoretical and empirical. And so it is quite common. I presume most of you are well aware of it. The von Neumann Morgenstern model predicts that a risk-averse agent will benefit from insurance, and in fact will fully insure if the insurance is actuarially fair, that is to say, if the premium equals the expected indemnity. But here's a puzzle. Farmers employ crop insurance far less than predicted or prescribed by the model, even when subsidized. So what's the problem? The widespread view is that the discrepancy between theory and practice is largely due to producers' ignorance. And this has prompted quite a bit of investment, time, and effort among agricultural economists to implement outreach and extension programs to convince farmers that they're dumb. But farmers are not dumb, okay? Their livelihood depends on the decisions they make. I'll never bet on that. I'll never bet on that. However, my argument is a simple one, that the discrepancy between theory and practice, that is, the theory that evolves from von Neumann Morgenstern utility theory, is more due to an incomplete theory of decision-making than farmer ignorance. The von Neumann Morgenstern model is inherently static and therefore inherently unable to capture what is the obvious substitute or best alternative to formal insurance or other risk management strategies, which is self-insurance. And this is just a term for saving for a rainy day. And so as a consequence, the standard von Neumann Morgenstern model that we were all taught in our graduate courses overstate the benefits of crop insurance and cannot adequately inform on its use. And this is the critique that I offer. They cannot reliably predict farmers' demand, willingness to pay for a new insurance product or changes in existing products, although the model is in fact used extensively and repeatedly for this very purpose. So in our paper, we explore how the ability to save, that is, to self-insure, impacts the benefits and optimal uses of formal insurance, like crop insurance. And we do this by modeling fairly straightforwardly a dynamically optimizing agent that has access to both insurance and the ability to save. Now, I normally don't like putting equations in my work, but I thought this at least would help out. The model we have in mind is a very simple one. So it is a dynamic optimization model, and the agent begins each period with a certain amount of wealth, and then they're going to take that wealth, and some of it they will save, and some of it they will use to purchase insurance. S is savings, X is coverage, pi is the premium rate, and it's a standard Bellman equation. The following period, the individual's wealth will be the income they receive we're assuming for simplicity here, it's constant. 1 plus R times savings, so that savings earn a rate of return R. And 1 minus the L squiggle is the insurable loss. So the net, if they're going to lose L, but recover X portion of that through the insurance payment. Okay, so just a very straightforward dynamic optimization problem, modeling the individual agent. And we find in this model that in a dynamic world in which saving is possible, the demand for insurance depends not on the curvature of the utility function, which was what Neumann Morgenstern utility presumes, but rather the curvature of the value function, which of course is endogenous. And we call this the curvature of the value function. That's the real number that one can use to measure aversion to risk, effective aversion to risk, the effective risk aversion, okay? So the thing is that the effective risk aversion, however you define it, it could be constant or absolute, depends less on the agent's primitive attitudes towards risk, which is what is assumed in a Neumann Morgenstern utility theory when you posit the utility function, and depends more on access to savings. And this will be reflected in the value function. And it will generally be less than the risk aversion embodied in the utility function. Stop and think about it. Yeah, sure, if somebody's allowed to save and to manage risk by saving for a rainy day, certainly they're going to appear to be less risk averse. And as such, the demand for insurance when saving is possible is less than that predicted by the V&M model. And so this is really the first point I want to make, is that ultimately we are looking to explain why does the Neumann Morgenstern model fail? Well, this is my proposition. We're not taking into account savings. And so I'm going to offer you just a few quick figures that the kind of findings that we get. None of these can emerge from a Neumann Morgenstern model, which is inherently static, okay? First, savings and insurance are substitutes. No surprise there. The demand, and as such, the demand for insurance declines if agent can save. And the poor cannot afford insurance, the rich don't need it. I'll show what I mean by that. Now let me explain this little figure for you. Imagine an individual wakes up one morning and now has to decide, given the amount of liquid wealth that I have, and given that tomorrow I may suffer a loss in production or whatever, what do I do? Do I save money or do I insure? Along the horizontal axis is the premium rate. Along the vertical axis is the interest rate. So let's look at this corner over here. Obviously, if the premium rate is really high, and if the return on savings is low, I won't do either. I won't save, I won't buy insurance. Let's look at over here where the return on savings is relatively high, but the premium rate is also relatively high. So it makes sense to save money in order to manage next period's risk. Let's go ahead and look at this portion over here. Here, the premium rate is relatively low. The interest rates are relatively low. The return on savings is relatively low. So it makes sense to purchase insurance. And there's going to be a region where you might have some combination of both. Here's the tell-all. Here's what you might, consider a demand function for insurance. Along the horizontal axis, a premium rate. How much does insurance cost me? And how much will I insure? And the red line is what you would generate effectively from the Neumann Morgenstern utility model, okay? But when you allow for savings, the demand function actually drops to the blue. In other words, the demand for insurance is far less when somebody has the alternative of saving for a rainy day. Basically, the main point here. And another interesting point is that, let's see, it's a function, a lot of work has been devoted to wealth effects and the demand for insurance. We get a different picture when we model this dynamically and allow for savings. And that is as I have wealth along here, and this is how much as a proportion of their current wealth somebody should optimally use to save, and how much will they insure? The red curve is the insurance line. We find that insurance is a relatively weak instrument operating only over certain levels of wealth. If the individual is very poor, okay, something, again, we don't have this in the von Neumann Morgenstern model, is somebody may not have the money, as it were, to purchase insurance. And this could be true, say, in a development setting, or basically it's not worth the foregone consumption. So at low levels of wealth, you don't insure. At high levels of wealth, you also do not insure. The poor cannot afford it. The rich don't need it. So, and at my last slide here. So our findings have implications for risk management and insurance demand research. In the von Neumann Morgenstern model, the coefficient of risk aversion is assumed to be an exogenous attitudinal primitive. And by that, I mean that it's an attitude. It's not going to be affected by market interest rates or insurance premium rates. And this would justify then using the von Neumann Morgenstern utility function of estimated in order to assess the implications of different insurance products and so on. But in a dynamic model, effective risk aversion is endogenous. In other words, the von Neumann Morgenstern utility model is elusive. And it depends not only on attitudes, but also market conditions, interest rates, premium rates, and so on. So the von Neumann Morgenstern model is at best a reduced form model. And that's okay, it might explain the data, but it cannot be used to analyze structural changes in insurance products or predict the demand for new insurance products, or for that matter, any kind of risk management policy. And but yet this is exactly what is most commonly done, or has been done, and continues to be done by agricultural economists when they're analyzing the demand for insurance or assessing risk management policies. They use von Neumann Morgenstern utility. The problem there is that that approach suffers from what we call the Lucas critique, and that is, as market conditions change, the underlying, the real utility function, the value function, is actually changing. And therefore, the reduced forms are not applicable for counterfactual policy analysis. And again, this is what is predominant in the literature. And that's my basic point. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to field them. I know there's only 5 of you, but I presume that this is being recorded and being put out in the cloud. And over the years to come, thousands of people will view this presentation. Anyways, go ahead. Does anybody have a question they would like to ask?
Yeah, I got a quick question. So actually, this is actually pretty interesting because, so for our family farm that I come from, so we rent most of our, almost just about everything we farm. And so historically, my dad's always bought insurance, but our primary landlord, they never bought insurance. And so they had probably a lot of working capital built up. You know, they had owned several hundred acres. They didn't really buy any insurance, but they did buy some insurance after 2014 because we had a hailstorm come through and took out probably about 2/3 of their acres. And so we had to replant about 2/3. But I think they do a lower coverage level than what we do, simply because they have higher working capital. And so they don't need as much insurance. It's made that catastrophic risk they're really looking at. So have you tried to look at those factors too, or if that would include different coverage levels?
Yeah, I've been working on this area for 30 years, both in the U.S. crop insurance program and more recently in the developing world. Like I said, farmers are not stupid. Your friends, your livelihood depends on this. Your business people are more inclined to think economists aren't real smart, you know. But there are reasons. Again, I've given reasons as to why I think farmers are not going to be particularly interested in purchasing insurance. They really have other means to manage risk, especially if you got plenty of money. Now in the developing world, that's a little different. Why do people buy it now? It's simple. It is subsidized by what, 80% when you put it all together? They're giving away crop insurance. Even if, so people do in fact buy crop insurance. Why do they do it? Do they do it to manage risk? No, they do it for a variety of reasons. One of them, it makes good business sense. You're going to make money on it, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's heavily subsidized. And secondly, maybe lenders will require you to purchase it, not because it's good for you, but it's because it's good for them. So I've worked in a lot of these areas, and if you're ever interested in talking more, I'll be happy to give you more than 2 minutes. But what you are telling me is perfectly sensible, and I'd love to talk. Who is it? Did you say it was your uncle that ran the other farm, or your friends, or your neighbor? Or?
Yeah, there were some neighbors that we had that ran the other farm.
Very good. Where is it?
It's in Nebraska, so about an hour west of Lincoln.
There you go. Great farming area. All right.
Yep.
If there are no other questions, I'll relinquish the floor to the next speaker.
All right, thank you. I can go next if it works for everyone. All right. All right, can everyone see my screen okay?
Yep.
All right, great. All right, so my name is Andrew Swanson. I am a third-year student at the University of California, Davis. I'm working on a paper that is investigating the effects of the low-carbon fuel standard. The low-carbon fuel standard is a policy passed by California in 2011, reissued in 2015, and this affects, it's a policy that tries to incentivize fuel suppliers to move towards low-carbon fuels. So how the LCFS does this, it uses a system of tradable credits and incentivize substitution towards alternative low-carbon fuels. And among this policy, ethanol is the second largest source of compliance credits. Big reason why that is because the renewable fuel standard mandates a certain level of ethanol consumption. And so because that ethanol is the third largest fuel by volume, and corn constitutes the majority of the feedstock used by ethanol in California, constitutes around 80%, some years higher, some years lower, but it's still a large, vast majority of the consumption. And the LCFS system differs from the renewable fuel standard because it incentivizes individual fuel producers to reduce their carbon emissions at the margin and earn more credits. And so under RFS, there's a set standard that if you have your emissions below that, then you qualify for the program. And so then you can receive the benefits from that program. But with LCFS, once you qualify for the program, you can continue to reduce your emissions and earn more credits. And so the actual incentive for plants to reduce their emissions, how the actual incentive for those plants to reduce those emissions is going to depend upon what they actually capture at the margin. And so part of that compliance credit value, however, could pass through to suppliers of feedstocks, so in this case, corn farmers, and also the buyers of byproducts of the ethanol production, such as distillers grains, which I'm going to talk about here a little bit. And so since corn is a primary input for ethanol production, changes in the marginal value of its outputs will be reflected in local corn prices. And so because ethanol plants can switch between different types of byproducts they produce, we can also see some of those effects within the prices of those byproducts. And so the goal is to measure the pass-through of these the ethanol subsidies to local corn ethanol byproduct markets. And hopefully, once we know that, we can also learn some more things about the incentives for ethanol plants to change their emissions under the policy. But because ethanol plants are rather large firms, some cases they, tell USA consumption for ethanol is about 30 to 40% of the corn market, and that could be even more in some local markets. And so market power within these could be a significant factor in how the corn prices react to the changes in the policy. And so that's one of the things we want to account for is any sort of market power within, find out how any market power possessed by these ethanol plants could be affecting the pass-through of these subsidies to corn prices. And it kind of has this counterintuitive effect where greater market power, it increases, it gives the ability of ethanol plants to capture more of those subsidies. And so it actually gives them a greater incentive to try to reduce their emissions. So again, the primary research question we're trying to look at is how does a marginal change in the value of those LCFS credits pass through to corn prices, and then do ethanol plants possess enough market power to affect the pass-through of the credit prices to corn prices. So again, a little more background with the program. Each fuel supplier applies to CARB, which is the primary regulatory authority for the program, and your emissions are based upon how much your rating. You get a rating from CARB. The rating depends upon how many, what's your carbon emissions per kilojoule of energy that you produce. And CARB sets a standard every single year. If you fall below the standard, you earn credits. If you're above the standard, then you have a deficit of credits. And so effectively, if you're below the standard, then your product is being subsidized. If you're above the standard, then your product is being taxed. And so ethanol plants can keep on, they can make improvements to their production process. So they can use landfill gas, they can use solar energy, you can carbon capture sequestration, or they can change their byproduct mix. And all these factors affect their carbon emission rating, which changes the amount of credits they receive or the amount of credits that they have to buy because they have a deficit. And so for every single 1 point reduction, an ethanol plant receives an additional 1 to 1.5 cents per gallon. And currently most ethanol plants are around 20 to 30 cents below the standard. And so they're receiving about 20 to 25 cents subsidy per gallon. But one of the ways that ethanol plants can affect this is by changing the type of distillers grains. So distillers grains is a primary byproduct of ethanol production, and it's also a primary source of feed for large cattle feeders. It's not really used for cow-calf operations. It's going to be primarily used as a feed operation for the finishing of cattle and also probably from stockers as well. And so it's very important because it's high protein, high nutrient content, but there are a couple different types of distillers grains that farmers can purchase. And those types are wet, dry, and modified. And the main difference between the three of them is that dry is the water content. And so the water content, with dry, the water content is around 10 to 15%, but with wet, the water content is around 55%. And so how that affects the carbon intensity rating is that the distillers grain, as it comes out of the production process, comes out in the wet form, but then ethanol plants have to dry it down using that requires energy, so that increases the carbon emissions. And so because of that, they receive less subsidies, but there's usually higher demand for dry because it's exportable. Wet, it can only be consumed by local cattle feeders. And so one of the things that makes ethanol a little bit interesting compared to the other biofuels within this program is that since the start of the program in 2011 to more recently 2021, 2022, ethanol has a steady decrease in the carbon intensity for the entire market as a whole within California. But the other biofuels, particularly biodiesel, renewable diesel, they haven't had the steady decrease in carbon emissions over time. And the big reason why there's a change around 2016, both in the ethanol, kind of more steep drop in ethanol, carbon intensity, but also for primarily affecting biodiesel and renewable diesel, is they changed some of the program because of some lawsuits surrounding the indirect land effects. And so that's why we see the large discrete change. But again, even since then, since 2016, there's still been a steady decrease in the average carbon intensity of that ethanol that's being consumed in California by around 10 to 15 points or so. And so a theoretical model that we use to try to analyze all this uses fixed proportions technology, constant cost, to estimate the pass-through of credit prices to corn prices. Each firm receives a distinct carbon intensity for both wet and dry distillers grain production. And the pass-through parameters defined in terms of elasticities, market power parameters, fixed proportions, and shocks to other prices. And then using the elasticity of corn supply and controlling for shocks to the prices enables the ability to determine market power's effects on the subsidy distribution. So here's the results that we have. So the proportion of, so we have showed the situation, we have 3 different elasticities. We have something that is, so the green line is when we have elasticity that's more elastic. We have neutral elasticity, unit elasticity, and then also an inelastic demand. And so again, we kind of see the effects that we'd expect to see, where on the x-axis, we have the ethanol plant's share in the local corn market. On the y-axis, we have the portion of the subsidy that's going to be captured by these ethanol plants. And we can see that as the share in the corn market increases, the amount of subsidy they're able to capture increases as well and tops out at around 75% of the subsidy. And so this model is done with credit price around $150. Carbon intensity of around 70 points which is the average carbon intensity of ethanol the past 2 years. And ethanol plant can capture up to 17 cents per bushel of corn sold. And so that's a decent amount that could be passing through to the corn farmers, but also a decent amount that's being captured on a bushel level by the ethanol plants. And so the results indicate that, again, that more market power increases the incentive of ethanol plants to decrease their carbon intensity because they're capturing more of the subsidy. Results uphold the findings that others have done as well, particularly Richard Sexton, a paper they had about the original effects of the Renewable Fuel Standard back in 2008. Also, a more recent paper by Jung et al. In the AAEA, which show that ethanol plants capture around like 50% or 50 cents a bushel, then using Indiana corn market. And it also kind of builds off the work that Margaret Foley and some others have done, showing that when policymakers design agriculture design policies that are trying to address some sort of externality, particularly environmental externality, doing with climate change or some sort of pollution factor, they need to take into account the local market structure, particularly where there's any market power, because that could change the effects of the policy. And so that's what I got.
Do you have a bottom line number that might adequately capture what's happening nationwide? A number I could use with my friends at dinner about what proportion of these subsidies are being captured by the ethanol plants? A rough number?
A rough number. So with it's just a California policy. And so.
Okay. Well, even in California.
Yeah. So with a California policy, probably 50% or so, I think is probably my best guess right
50%.
now. Yeah, it's still a little preliminary just because we're working with CARB to get some data from them, to get more data from them, because it's the data that's out there right now that we have. A lot of it is, it's pretty heavily aggregated because they're trying to protect the ethanol plants and not show any information where we positively identify which ethanol plant is sending each bit of the volume. And so we're working with CARB to try to disaggregate that and get a better understanding what's happening at the plant level, so then we can try to model the local corn markets better. So right now it's just kind of more of a market-wide effect, just because with the different local markets, there could be different factors, particularly about like how many cattle feeders are nearby. You know, is it on this going to be the eastern corn belt? You know, Iowa. Is this going to be like Illinois, Indiana, or is it Western corn belt, Nebraska, Minnesota? Those are trying to effects that we really want to try to dive down into and try to see like how much, when you have a lot higher percentage of cattle feeders nearby, how is that affecting the market as well? But around probably like, I don't know, 25 to 50% is probably what I'll say that range. I'll give you a range to be safe.
Yeah, well, that's good enough. Yeah. All right, thanks.
Thank you. All right, that covers it.
Do we have anybody left, or?
Okay. Is there anyone that has to present? Monica already presented, so Ambali, do you need to present?
Going once, going twice. Sold to America.
No, I think exactly. No, so I suspect we can wrap up for today.
Thanks so much, everyone. Lots of interesting stuff. Thank you for presenting and listening.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks.
Enjoyed meeting you all virtually. Hopefully someday we'll get to meet in person at the meetings.
Absolutely.
So.
All right. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
All right. Goodbye.
Bye.
Take care.